Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. And on behalf of our team at the Carnegie Endowment, I want to welcome you all to this online launch event for a new initiative of Carnegie's Asia program in collaboration with our colleagues from across the institution on the future of continental Asia and how to reimagine its future. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies at Carnegie. And if you know anything about me, I've had a career that has at one point or another focused on pretty much every subregion of Asia, East, Central, and South. And that description of my career in itself tells you something because it breaks the region down into disparate subregions and self-contained geographies, when in fact, the historical norm was that Asia was an astonishingly integrated part of the world, where goods, people, religions, ideas, and inventions trafficked both maritime and continental transit routes. And contact and connection was, for much of history, actually quite routine. That we break Asia down into subregions, as I did a second ago, at all, is a function, I think, in part of imperial histories, colonial pathologies, and to be blunt about it, the Cold War. But we're 3 decades on from the end of the Cold War, and it's time for some new thinking. And the reality is that many of the concepts for thinking about Asia that we've inherited from the recent past just aren't that useful anymore. Now, while contemporary Asia is becoming more integrated again, I think it's the region's maritime spaces that have a tendency to suck the oxygen out of a lot of the debate about Asia's future. And that's a natural function of several factors. For one, you've got China's rapid emergence as an expeditionary power and a major global commercial maritime player. For another, we have the importance of seaborne trade to the global economy. Then there are the strategic links between the Indian and Pacific Oceans that are at the heart of the concept of a so-called Indo-Pacific region that has become so central, for example, to American national security strategy in this part of the world. And of course, there is the existence of potential war triggers in maritime Asia, not least in the Taiwan Strait, but also in the South China Sea. And so this attention on the maritime space is both natural and appropriate. And as Vice President of Carnegie, I'm proud to say that we've built at our institution a truly spectacular team and a program on maritime Asia, including a marquee dialogue among island countries of the Indian and Pacific Oceans that took place for the third time just 2 weeks in New York City. And you can live stream some of that on the Carnegie website. But here's the thing, the water gets all the attention, but I think the land matters a lot too. And this region, the great Eurasian landmass, is in fact highly dynamic and in a lot of flux. So I say this as the former American Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central Asia. The American withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Taliban victory in that country has made at least some outside powers, not least the United States, a lot less relevant. And most important, it's given local players, the people who actually live in this part of the world, the opportunity to take the lead in promoting regional connectivity and diplomatic engagement. And so they are discussing among themselves strategic and economic futures in ways that I think are really unprecedented. Now, one thing that's especially striking, and we're going to talk about this morning, is that they're doing so with confidence, not with fear. For example, the last time the Taliban was in power, some of you may recall that Central Asian countries feared spillover effects and prioritized a very defensive approach to their security. Today, I think, by contrast, they're engaging each other and even engaging the Taliban itself from a place of much greater confidence, not a place of deep-seated fear. And that means, to be blunt about it, that we need to flip the script. We often hear metaphors for continental Asia like a so-called great game being played in the region by outside powers. But these outside powers, and especially my country, the United States, are, to my mind, less relevant than they've ever been. And in any case, even the ones that are still relevant, like China, are hardly dictating terms anymore. So the people who live in the region are not the objects of competition so much as they are the subjects of their very own stories. And so that, and this is why I'm telling you all this, is what we're going to try to explore in this new multi-year Carnegie initiative, which we're calling Reimagining Continental Asia. We're going to look at new strategic dynamics, diverse economic futures, people, technology, culture, innovation, global connectivity, all of this in an effort to recenter our conception of the region on the people who actually live there. And this will include both research and convening. And I'm delighted to be joined for this little mini launch by my two co-curators of this initiative. One is my friend Jennifer Murtazashvili, who's a non-resident scholar in Carnegie's Asia program, but also runs a major research center at the University of Pittsburgh. Also Temur Umarov, a fellow at Carnegie's Russia-Eurasia Center in Berlin, as well as another actually new Carnegie colleague, Nicole Grajewski, and also the fantastic Asel Doolotkeldieva from George Washington University. And so that's a little background on what we're trying to do. And team, on the presumption that you agree with my setup, because if you don't, fire away, take a shot and tell me while I'm wrong. I thought maybe we would start with Jen, because you and I have been talking about this theme for, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, maybe 10 years, Jen. But you just had a piece that I read a couple of days ago that basically began with this idea that in the wake of the war in Afghanistan, the American withdrawal, the Taliban rise, what we're seeing is a set of confident countries rather than a group of countries that are cowering in fear. And if that's the case, it suggests not only that they're not defensive about their security, but there's something happening in the region that's fueling that confidence. And you've been doing this for such a long time. I thought I'd give you the first shot to try to talk about how you've seen local agency evolve over, let's say, a decade or two, and what's different using Afghanistan as a proxy for that. Why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Thanks, Evan, for the kind introduction. And it's just an honor to be here with this team, this incredible team that you've assembled. And it's wonderful that Carnegie's giving us this platform to talk about this, because this isn't an issue that many people are speaking about. As you mentioned, we see Asia split up into so many parts, and these parts themselves don't make sense any longer. To be frank. And Afghanistan is a really good example of this. So for many, many years, the United States put AFPAC, right? US strategy towards Afghanistan was AFPAC. And for Afghans consider themselves to be a really integral part of Central Asia. But because of the Soviet legacies, you talk to scholars in Central Asia and they see, Afghanistan is part of South Asia. And to me, that these lines of demarcation don't make as much sense as they once did. And we're seeing how this diplomacy in the region and the US withdrawal is allowing countries who were once so divided come together. And it's amazing, I spent many years in Uzbekistan during the height of the Karimov era and during the previous Taliban government. And there was such a cold relationship that Uzbekistan had with Pakistan, no recognition of the Taliban whatsoever. This time around, when the Taliban came to power, it wasn't that the Uzbeks, for example, or the Kazakhs were excited about the Taliban. There's real concerns about them as governing agents and their ability to govern, but they are able to deal with them and they feel very comfortable. And I think it was Evan, you pointed out that shortly after the takeover, Uzbek Foreign Minister Abdulaziz Kamilov posted these pictures of himself with the Afghan acting Foreign Minister Mutaki from the 90s and from today. And this was a signal to the world that we know who we're dealing with. This isn't some alien force. These are people who we know. And this is an authority that we feel comfortable with. And frankly, the United States military performance over many years in Afghanistan left so many people so disheartened. And I think, we're looking right now at the war in Ukraine, which I know Asel will talk about in a minute, but to Central Asian states, the United States was completely discredited in many, many ways with the way that it withdrew from Afghanistan. I would say that is especially true of, the countries that border Afghanistan. So what's happened since then is that we have seen incredible agency of countries in the region trying to negotiate trade, export, rail deals, infrastructure deals that will connect Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, what is called Central Asia, to what is historically called South Asia. Because these landlocked countries understand that, number one, they're in sanctions land. It's just something you hear all the time. So how do these countries navigate, they're landlocked, so that means that trade is hard, it's expensive, countries are poor because of it, but yet they're surrounded by sanctions. How do they navigate this? And so this requires a lot of creativity locally. This requires them to do things that they haven't normally done. So you talk to, Uzbek authorities, they are so excited about building this railway, from Uzbekistan into Afghanistan and down into Pakistan. Now, many of us here in the West look at this as sort of a crazy idea because, look, Afghanistan's been so unstable, and where's the money going to come from? Well, there's a hope that Afghanistan can remain stable. But what we're seeing now are, huge, not just a play for Central Asia, but increasing interconnectivity of the Iranians, huge activity of the Iranians, the Turks, even the Qataris from across this landmass are so involved with one another in ways they haven't been before. So to me, this is a real exciting time for us to be studying this and to really rethink our assumptions and to rethink the paradigms that we have for these regions.
We deliberately named this project Continental Asia, not Central Asia.
Yeah.
Central Asia conventionally means the 5 former Soviet countries: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan. Continental Asia means the whole mix of economic, innovation, transit, diplomatic, and strategic issues that span the continental landmass, because we're going to pull all that in. And by the way, the 5 countries and the 6, if you count Afghanistan, are not the only people that live in this part of the world. But I want to push you on one theme that I think actually will set up a cell nicely. You said something interesting. You talked about the distrust of the United States that ensued in the region because of the way the United States left Afghanistan. But I think, to go back and think a little bit about some of your work that I've read, the way the United States conducted itself even over a 20-year period. And so it raises the question for me of how much this rise in local confidence is a function of genuine confidence, or how much of this is just an utter collapse in confidence that outside powers truly know what they're doing. And so there was a time when, let's just take the Central Asians, there were colonial parts of the former Russian Empire. Then you have the Chinese arriving in the region as an outside player that provides largesse, capital, people, technology. It's a trader, a builder, a lender, an investor. And then you got the United States that, from the standpoint of many people, just kind of messed up in Afghanistan. So is the issue that there's greater confidence and greater agency, or is it just that people who live in this part of the world don't think outside powers, number one, know what they're doing, number two, necessarily have the best interests of the countries at heart, number three, even if and when they do, are not able to act in ways that reflect their priorities? And so essentially the message is, hey, we got this. We got this because we have to have this, because relying on outside players has not, in fact, been conducive to the agendas that the countries have for their own growth, opportunity, development, and security. How much of this is a rise in local confidence, and how much of it is a rise in confidence by fiat because they just can't trust anybody else anymore?
It's got to be both, right? I think on the one hand, look, the military performance, if we look at what happened in Afghanistan, especially in the northern parts, this was an area, in 2005, 2006, that was seen as very stable. Fast forward 10, 15 years later, the heart of the insurgency is playing out in the north. The most unstable part of Afghanistan was in the north. And so you have neighbors who are looking at this, right? Saying, well, the United States we agreed to host military bases, United States military bases in our own country, the promise that this could kind of bring stability. But what we're seeing is just the opposite. And if the United States can't do it, and others have destabilized, there's a longer history of people intervening in Afghanistan and generating a lot of instability, then maybe it's up to us. So that kind of now, and not all countries, for example, in the region have agreed on what that strategy should be. And to me, this actually signifies this kind of confidence, that they're disagreeing with one another. There's huge debates about what policy towards Afghanistan should be inside of the region. And we're talking about not just, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, but also Iran and Pakistan, which is part of this, this continental landmass that is also interconnected.
Okay, so this is a good place to transition to Asel. Talk a little bit, maybe a good place to start. I don't know if you like this frame, but I'm going to try it out on you anyway. Talk a little bit about the rise of identity locally and the collapse of what I would call a derivative identity, meaning, for example, having been parts of the former Soviet Union leaning on Russia. I remember a conversation I had when I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central Asia. I remember conducting a dialogue with the Russian government on Central Asia. It was part of a bilateral we had with Russia. And the counterpart across the table, who I won't name, but was a very senior Russian diplomat, essentially, he was lamenting what he characterized as the decline in the use of Russian language in the region. And he talked about bloggers and he talked about local language use. And he said, this is terrible. He said, this is terrible because it's not, people want their own identity, but the reality is Russian, like English, like Chinese, like French, it's a global language. And so if you want this region connected to the world, they need to lean on connectivity to each other and to the Russian metropole in a way that reflects both linguistic and cultural and historical connectivity. And so he's lamenting that. And if I fast forward, that must have been 2006 or 2007. So we're now in 23, 24. In a place like Uzbekistan, local language bloggers play such a huge role. In Kazakhstan, you've seen so much local identity, nationalism, people talking about Kazakh history. And now along comes the Ukraine war, where you now have this strategic and geopolitical overlay of countries that actually fear Russia, where there's a lot of ambivalence about what the current regime in Moscow is doing, notwithstanding deep cultural and historical connections to Russian people. They don't like what Mr. Putin's regime is doing in Ukraine. And to what extent has that further fueled this? Talk a little bit about the interstices between the rise of local identity and what happened as a result of Mr. Putin's war in Ukraine and what that's meant for identity and confidence in the region.
Sure. Thank you, Ivan. This is a fascinating question. And I think a lot of people are actually looking at this issue right now. On the one hand, you are right that the language issue is now really probably challenge number one in the region. At least if you follow just some public debates in Kazakhstan, you would immediately jump into that. But I think it's actually connected. Some Russian polittechnology and politicians still complain 20 years later about that Russian is diminishing its influence in the region. But I think their lamenting and complaints are really related to their Russian soft power, because it's through their Russian language that they seek to establish schools, for example, right? The primary schools and the trainings for teachers. And through this language, then they promote certain ideas and ideologies and policies. So it's not exactly about identity, but more, I think, connected to the soft power issue. Now, for example, language is very important, but it's only a part of identity. And I'm interested, for example, how Russia conveys certain loyalties beyond its borders. And of course, identity is one thing, but language is not only the key to that, because, for example, if you take Kyrgyzstan, language is not an issue anymore for a very long time. The majority of Kyrgyz people do speak Kyrgyz, and it's really the minority, some middle-class urban satellite in Bishkek and some intellectual elites which are Russophone. But then this Kyrgyz-speaking majority population are very much pro-Russian. right? Before the war, it was up to 90% of Russian population supporting Russia and Putin. So kind of language is only one key to the identity. If you look further into identity, it's really about still sharing some of the colonial legacy, and Russian state propaganda is quite successful in still promoting narratives about this shared Soviet project and the belonging and the great civilizational mission, and which then basically developed these nations which were nothing but a rubble before the Soviets came, according to that propaganda. So that is quite successful in working on certain segments of society, not all. And there I really would like to actually really highlight that Central Asia, when we now just talk about it like that, is really not a homogeneous bloc. It's extremely diverse, right? And Kazakhstan in that regard is quite different from Kyrgyzstan, although they are neighbors and they share language and culture and so on and so forth. In Kazakhstan, you can see right now really very important grassroots processes of rethinking. It's not just rethinking history and language, and I really would not want to use the word nationalism because it's kind of, wrought with a certain understanding of nationalism as it is interpreted in the West. I think here people are more about keen to understand their traumas and finally speak up about their traumas and finally to make sense of those traumas and what this have done to societies and really large groups of people. So it's still a very, very important and large process, but very open. We don't know where it's going to lead. It's going to lead to more religious projects at the end, more nationalist, more authoritarian projects at the end. We don't know. So there are also really other important processes shaping currently the relationship between Russia and Central Asia in the light of the full invasion of Ukraine. And this is really something that is not probably fully understood, is that these are very much authoritarian dynamics. So, for example, if you look from outside at Central Asia currently, foreign observers think that Russia is very much pressuring on Central Asia to exert its influence over Central Asian states, for example, by promoting the foreign agents law. But actually, it's not exactly about pressures and influence of Russia. I think it's really up to the local authoritarian regimes to import those laws, which are because they are simply very convenient to clamp down on civil society, mass media, expert community, and so on and so forth. So there is this authoritarian learning across the post-Soviet space, which also, of course, bring back these authoritarian regimes. There was initially this very much strange expectation that Central Asian states would distance themselves from Russia due to the war, and therefore there would be more space for the Western actors to come in due to the weakened Russia. But I think what is really not taken into account that what really brings together Russian leadership and Central Asian leaders is the common authoritarian dynamic, right? The survival of these regimes are very much dependent on Kremlin due to many different factors, including the simply very heavy presence of FSB in the region, which also control the elites, not only of civil society, and the intrusion of Russia into elections, into opposition, into many different political processes. So it would be really, I think, huge expectation now to think that Central Asian leaders would distance themselves from Russia so easily,
So you see the main residual connection to Russia as being more complementary politics rather than sentiment, history, and emotion.
I think it's all together, to be honest. It's an extremely complex picture. So there are different dynamics happening at the regime level, but also on the societal level. The whole economic activity is now being reshaped due to the war. So if initially we expected that those economies would go down, Well, now there is actually very much enhanced economic activity between Russia and Central Asia. And all these actors, why should they really take seriously the promises of the West, which are not really concrete, if there is really a boom in activity? On the other hand, there is also the societies which are suffering from really soaring prices, huge inflation. There's social discontent about how to manage the energy crisis, which affect all of the countries, how to make through the winter. So there are really different, sometimes contradictory dynamics at hand right now, caused or enhanced by the war.
Can I just ask you a really blunt question? Can one separate the language issue from some of these political issues? For example, there are probably 5 million Kyrgyz speakers. There are probably 11, 12 Kazakh speakers in the world, but there are millions and millions of Russian speakers across many countries around the world. Mm-hmm. So that argument that was made to me was made in a political context. Essentially, what that Russian official was saying was the loss of Russian language in individual countries he was viewing it as a loss of Moscow's influence in the region. Mm-hmm. But one could flip this and make this less of a political argument and make it more about history and identity. That actually common use of the Russian language connects countries to one another. It connects them to some larger global history of connectivity. And so the fragmentation of countries into separate languages actually makes them less cosmopolitan in a way. Quite a separate, and you separate that historical and linguistic question from the political question. In other words, speaking Russian language doesn't necessarily mean you support Mr. Putin's regime. It's just a legacy of history that actually creates some connectivity to others across countries and actually therefore serves as an integrating function, including for things like business, commercial transactions. Can one separate that, or is language and politics so intertwined now for Central Asians, for example, that it's hard to make that distinction?
Well, I think for certain segments of society, of polity, language is now being politicized as an identity issue. But I think it's a very much more profound and complicated, because it is indeed a factor of integration, because you have this Eurasian Union and most of the paperwork, most of the dealings happen in Russian language. There is also the question, okay, if we don't anymore speak Russian, how are we going to connect between Central Asians and Tajikistan, right? Because Tajiks are not Turkophone. So this is another issue that's going to be in the future challenging the regional integration, which is now timidly rising as well. So I don't think that, I think for Russia, I mean, this politicizing the language issue is actually quite a typical thing to do, not only in Central Asia, but in other parts of the post-Soviet bloc, right? As a part of their soft power. And it's a big issue for also Central Asians, because it's also, they feel like, at least for the ordinary citizens, that it is a time to really revive now their own language, their own culture, and not to suffer under the domination of the Russian language, because language was also really a mechanism of violence during the Soviet Union. Millions of people were really marginalized due to language barriers, and there were certain groups which were more mobile due to speaking Russian. So it's a very complicated process, both historical, but also linking the region through the economic and social activity, and very much politicized currently.
Great, thanks. Okay, so Temur, that's a good transition to you, because among other things, first, you're Uzbek, so you're in a country that, I mean, you come from a country that increasingly is looking for other partners as well. But second is all about creating options and optionality in its relationships, partly because it's leveraging those to pursue its own agenda. So pull in some of these other non-Russian players, China, Turkey, anybody else you want to pull in. But as I said, center this on the interests, options, and equities of continental Asian countries themselves. How do they look at other players? How are they leveraging those to the extent that they are? And how much leverage and agency do they really have in leveraging those relationships for their own agendas, which I would presume are basically centered on growth, employment, upskilling, sustainability, and connectivity in more directions on the compass to a greater variety of partners that can serve that purpose of growth, employment, and opportunity.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Evan, for the great question. I want to start by following up a little bit on what Asel and Jen have already said. I think that many things that happened in the last couple of years with Central Asia, around Central Asia, in continental Asia, proves the main theme of our new initiative, the theme of the region being more confident and the region having more agency that many people in our sphere believe they have. If we talk about, for example, the war in Ukraine and Russia's presence in Central Asia and how Central Asia is reacting to that, there were many predictions before the war become a long-term event that Central Asian countries would have to support Russia on a full scale and go after whatever Kremlin says, because there is this enormous dependency on Russia. On the other hand, some people were thinking that, oh, now Russia would become so weak that China would replace it. In Central Asia, the main problem with all of those theories was that in all of them, the region was seen as an object, and the only thing that some experts were taking into consideration were the interests of other players around the region. But reality is much more different, is much more complicated. And in reality, we see that Central Asia is, playing different actors against each other. Central Asia is very pragmatically looking into what are, those directions where the region can go with specific partner, and at the same time be in a friendly terms with another one, even though those two partners might be in the middle of conflict. Take a look at how Central Asia's diplomacy is booming with the West, and how they are doing it together as a C5 platform. There was a meeting with the President of the United States for the first time in history. There was a meeting with EU representatives. There was a recent meeting in Germany, in Berlin. At the same time, we see that Central Asian countries are also visiting Moscow during the military parade, and shaking hands with Vladimir Putin. And at the same time, we see how all of them are together joining Xi Jinping in the summit in Xi'an. So Central Asia isn't just a limited space that many other countries are fighting for. Central Asia is kind of an agent in international relations, and I think we see nowadays how Central Asia is acting. And I would say main foreign policy priority for the region for the last 3 decades, if we put it very kind of bluntly, would be diversification of their ties with the world, because the region itself in the 90s appeared on the map as a part of the world that is very much dependent on Russia. I mean, historically, naturally, but it's impossible to develop economically, to be politically independent if you have such a presence of one country in so many different spheres inside. It's just natural that Central Asian countries, sometimes together, sometimes separately, have new agreements with many different other actors. So here China matters geographically because it's the second biggest neighbor for the region, and it opens many more opportunities in economy, in logistics, and in the last couple of decades, Central Asia was successful in replacing Russia as the main economic partner by China. In other examples, for example, if we take security, we see right now how Central Asian countries, for example, Tajikistan, is having a diversified set of countries with whom it has different sorts of security agreements. There is a military base of Russia inside of Tajikistan. Tajikistan is a part of CSTO, but at the same time, we have People's Armed Police of China having two bases on the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. We also know that India has access to a military airport in Tajikistan. Tajikistan also has a military agreement with Iran, which allows Tajikistan to use Iranian drones, for example, in border conflicts with Kyrgyzstan. And there are also many other examples across the region in this regard. And I just want to say that the region is dynamic, and Central Asian countries trying to find different niches for specific partners around the world, starting from Japan and ending with the US. The ideal picture for Central Asia would be that many different partners that sometimes cannot coexist with each other have the region where regional actors can make an atmosphere of those countries able to coexist.
Great. So Nicole, I'm going to ask you to pull Iran into the picture, but before I do that, I just need to pick up on something Timur said. I'm going to throw this to anybody who wants to pick up on this. So Asel, in her first set of remarks, pointed out the diversity of the countries. And you said it's important not to overgeneralize. They're very different. Turkmenistan, very different than Uzbekistan, very different than Afghanistan. They're all very different. So we need some granularity in how we think about this. Timur talked about acting together in diplomacy, a C5+1 with the United States. And frankly, if you just think about it logically, if you're a small country and you're landlocked, there's strength in numbers in general. So from the standpoint of strategic interests and leverage, small countries across the region would do a lot better if they acted collectively, jointly, or at minimum in complementary ways, okay? Which, number one, runs you into the question of diversity that Asel raised, but also just frankly conflicts among and between them. I mean, if we move further west in Continental Asia, look what's going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan even just this week. Jen, I mean, you were in Uzbekistan back in the day when, Mr. Karimov, I remember he didn't get along with anybody. He couldn't get along with the Kyrgyz. He couldn't get along with the Tajiks. It was so much the opposite of, let's say, Kazakhstan's foreign policy, right? President Nazarbayev played this, they called it multi-vector game, where they would, as Timur just described, balance outside players. I always felt that Mr. Karimov was the un-Nazarbayev. He would swing wildly for, 1 week he would be completely pro-Russian. The next week he would be completely pro-American. The next week he would be anti-American. I took over in the government after they threw us out of an airbase in 2005. And it was just like rock bottom of the US-Uzbek relationship. So where's the balance as countries, governments, and especially people, let's say across civil society links, are thinking about, let's say, strength in numbers and forging not a unity, but a complementarity in order to increase their leverage and achieve their aims, versus the reality of these political differences, elite conflicts, this leader doesn't like that leader, and the inheritance of history that involves a lot more security and other pathologies. I'll just throw that to anybody that wants to take a crack at that.
I just very, very briefly, just to state that, we are so focused on the war in Ukraine right now. We forget about the implications of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And one of the things that did is it opened up. I mean, we see now, like Nicole will talk about Iran. We're seeing a huge Iranian initiative. We're seeing the Turks. We're seeing everybody sort of make a play for one another in this region. And I don't think it's settled, right? To answer your question, Evan, that there's so much activity right now there, and there's so much uncertainty that everyone's sort of hedging their bets and throwing, darts in every single direction, not punches, but, they're darts they're throwing to try to build connectivity. And the reason they want to do this is to hedge their bets against, number one, sanction, number two, being too dependent, as Asel said, on any one single power. And then the fact that we're talking about the landlocked part of Asia, not maritime Asia, mean that people's options are necessarily, they don't have the same kind of options for trade and commerce. But if we think about, will they be able to work together, particularly the Central Asian states? And I think that's the question that you're getting at. The answer is, I think that we've never seen a period of time where countries in Central Asia appear to be on the brink of greater regional cooperation than they have been at any time in the past. Okay. Now, what will happen from this? I mean, it is pretty sad that the only regional organization is CARIC, and that people are very excited that there was a statement at the UN on environmental issues in the spring. So people are pointing to this as like the two major accomplishments of Central Asia's regional integration. There's a long way to go, and there are a lot of spoilers along the path, I suppose.
But you think it's changed, because Temur mentioned the US has a C5+1 now, right? As if this is some kind of great new innovation. Sorry, folks, but back in my day, 20 years ago, the US had a C5+1. We had a trade and investment framework agreement, which when I was Deputy Assistant Secretary, we actually bumped up to a ministerial, and we had trade ministers from all 5 countries. But the reality is we couldn't do a damn thing because the countries didn't get along. They didn't view things in a complementary way. We proposed water sharing deals. The Uzbeks and the Tajiks went at it. We proposed road building. People said, no, there's customs procedures at the border, and truck drivers were backing up for 14 hours. So it's not that the effort is new. It's that working jointly is hard. And it used to be easy because you could just ask Russia to do it for you. So in the Soviet days, Moscow would just decide it by administrative fiat. Then actually independence came, they had to get along and do it together, and they couldn't. So what I'm asking you is, since logically they should, and everybody agrees that they should, are you seeing that in a way now that is unprecedented, dramatically different, and what's caused that? And you seem to be answering kind of a hedged yes. But it's still, they're on the cusp of it, and they haven't really they haven't hit the tipping point. Have I characterized that correctly?
No, I think that's right. And then, we can look at, I still think that the reforms in Uzbekistan post Karimov really transformed everything in the region, because Uzbekistan's geographic location touches on the borders of all of these countries. So when Uzbekistan was closed off to the world, so much of this was impossible. When Uzbekistan opened, and all of a sudden, you could travel from Dushanbe to Samarkand to Shymkent very easily. That really changed, I think, how people saw the region themselves. But it's not all rosy, and I'm sure Asel will talk about like the Kyrgyz-Tajik conflict, right? So for the first time, while we're seeing this great push towards greater regional integration, we're also seeing for the first time the first interstate conflict in the region. Yeah. So there's a lot of these paradoxes, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. There are all these paradoxes which are very difficult to make sense. Here, I mean, there was no real investigation done on this military conflict of last year, and therefore it's extremely difficult to understand what was on the mind of Tajik and Kyrgyz leadership, right? That led to this conflict. And therefore, it's very difficult to understand what were the dynamics behind this militarization of the conflict. Because although it was the first interstate war, but, well, yeah, people in Batken call it a war, but it's, of course, dates to Soviet times. So it's a very protracted, historically long conflict. But, you know, I mean, I'm still hopeful, like Jen, because if you're in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, there's really, people talk really about these two nations now really kind of pushing the region forward. There is a lot of cooperation going on between these two countries. And what in Kazakhstan, they hope that if they see that these two countries are cooperating really intensely, that the rest of Central Asia would simply bandwagon and kind of join that group, and somehow they're going to be more cooperation. But it's certainly not up to the West to lead anything of that. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, of course, there's this optimism about this Washington summit, the Berlin summit, but it's just a symbolical show thrown because probably out of really in the absence of real things. I'm sorry to Biden to say that we continue to extort resources in Kazakhstan. What's new about that, really? And is it something that we need more resources to be extracted in the region, really? Kind of, and what about climate change and everything, right? So I don't think that this is what's gonna really make the region greater. So I think what has to be really sad is that what Temur was saying, that something has happened in these last years in the region that makes it a little bit different. I think it's one of these factors is really that there's a huge disappointment with the West. The West, with its kind of agenda on democratization, civil society building, LGBT, human rights, and of course, thanks also partly to the Russian propaganda, right, anti-Western propaganda. But I think if you talk to the diplomats in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, they really say that it's enough, that the West cannot teach us anymore. The West should abandon this teaching role, and we're not anymore in the position of taking the lessons from the West. We have other partners, and let's look at China. Let's go towards the Gulf countries. Let's go towards Asia. There are plenty of opportunities over there. So there's, I think, this partly some of this, I'm not sure to call it confidence, but at least the diversification and looking for partners somewhere else. And the West is considered more as this basically arrogant, superior that didn't learn the lesson that all that efforts failed. And I think this is one of this actually quite important dynamic which is shaping the region currently.
Okay. Temur, can you hold your thought for a second? Because I want to go to Nicole. And Nicole, I want you to talk about Iran a little bit, because again, we're in danger, number one, of conflating Central Asia and Continental Asia together. And from my vantage point, Iran is it's an actual player in the region. It's both a maritime and a continental country, but actually its maritime options are constricted by several factors. One is American policy, which is quite hostile to Iran. And let's face it, Iranian policy, quite hostile to the United States. Second, a lot of the port projects that were so ambitious, Chabahar, have just not taken off. So it's hard to see Iran as a major maritime hub, at least commercially, in an environment of sanctions, conflict, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it does beg the question of whether Iran looks to a continental identity to create some optionality for itself, and then how other countries that share continental spaces with Iran are going to think about that. Because to go back to this theme of mistrust, if there's any country that's not trusted by a lot of countries that are its neighbors, it's Iran. And I mean, we can do chapter and verse on this, on why that's the case. It includes language, religion, the nature of the regime, the nature of the people in charge of the regime, and so on. But pull Iran into the conversation a little bit, not just as an outside player, but actually as a player that's inherent and intrinsic to the region a little bit.
Well, thank you for that question. And also, thank you for launching this initiative. I think it's a great idea, and you have such an amazing team at Carnegie Asian, across Carnegie. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys produce. In terms of Iran and Central Asia, Iran and Continental Asia, Iran has long sought to actually portray itself as both a continental and a maritime power. I mean, when the Soviet Union collapsed, you see Iranian diplomats going and establishing consulates and discussing about all the opportunities that Iran can link these countries to international markets. A lot of that rhetoric is continuing today when you see Iran discussing certain rail projects with the Central Asian states. Iran has sought to kind of use its geographic position as a way of attracting countries. However, this has also been riled with a lot of skepticism from the part of the region, especially when it came to Iranian intentions. So as much as Iran would like to tout, the opportunities that come with trade, that come with integration, there's been a lot of skepticism, especially in the 90s, towards Iran's proselytization in the region, whether or not Iran was going to export the revolution. One person in particular was Islam Karimov, who had quite a adverse reaction to any kind of Iranian involvement in the region, partly linked to the Tajik civil war. And so there's all these kind of factors that kind of are historic that have actually precluded Iran from really playing a larger role in the region until I think about 5-6 years ago, where you see a greater push from the Iranian side. Obviously, this does coincide with maximum pressure, with Iran's kind of isolation. And Iran has looked and kind of sought to portray itself much more aligned with this Eastern identity and kind of this Eastern vector. More recently, the Iran-Uzbek relationship has transformed. There's been an improvement. Mirziyoyev was in Iran recently. This was quite a big achievement. A lot of the Iranian press was hailing this as a testament to Iran's involvement. Iran's joined certain organizations in the region, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So Iran's trying, and at least will continue to pursue this kind of Eastern-oriented vector, which often actually is misconstrued as just being focused on Russia and China, but it really includes continental Asia. And part of that also includes Iran trying to raise to the status of kind of a regional power. And this obviously can open the door to many conflicts as well.
And what's happened to all the intrinsic fear of the Iranian regime that I used to hear about in the region all those years? And that's before you overlay the religious element within Islam onto it, because it's so different in some of these countries. What's happened to that? Is that dissipating? Because the Mirziyoyev thing that you're describing, that's just practical, right?
Mm-hmm.
You got to live there, you got to deal with them. So he's trying to create some space from a strategic standpoint. But that's not the same as sentiment, encouraging connectivity that actually creates dependencies. What's happened to all that insecurity?
Well, I think it's also a shift in what Iranian priorities were. So under Rafsanjani, a lot of it was cultural and religious. They opened a lot of cultural centers. And I think the Iranians understood that this was causing quite a sharp reaction throughout the region, and also realizing that Persian language didn't go so far in Tajikistan, that couldn't form the basis of the relationship. That Iranian religious sentiment was not really being picked up throughout those countries. And so I think one thing that actually Asel was talking about with kind of regime security, with authoritarianism, Iran found that quite attractive. And if you look at a lot of Iran's engagement in the region, it's kind of included that. So Iran's kind of emerged as a country that shares a similar sentiment, shares similar concerns to protest movements, and doesn't seek to foment that or foment instability. And I think you can see that with a lot of their interactions when it comes to Iran taking verbatim sections of laws relating to civil society that, for example, Uzbekistan had or Kazakhstan had, and actually integrating it into its own domestic laws. And so I think that's also a really interesting dynamic about this kind of diffusion of certain practices. And it's quite apparent with the Iranian case.
Yeah, we're going to run a little bit over the top of the hour, so we have a little bit of time. But I want to invite the audience, if you do have questions, to just put them in the chat, and our very good team will throw them to us. Could I go back to the transatlantic West? I hate to do this because the whole point of this initiative is not to talk about the transatlantic West and to recenter it. But I'm an American, and Americans, we're very simple people. We think that we have a global profile, and therefore we're relevant in every part of the world. And there's a reason for that that's intrinsic to the region, which is quite naturally, if you're sitting in the region, there's a lot that the transatlantic West can offer that you would want to tap into and leverage for your own growth and opportunity. And in fact, I can remember when leaders in the region used to try to do that. I'll never forget, Jen, you may or may not know this story, but when my former boss, the former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, reorganized the State Department in 2005 to take the countries of Central Asia bureaucratically out of a westward-facing bureau that put them with Russia and Europe and put them with South Asia. I'll never forget when, well, I won't tell you which president, but one of the presidents, one of the more assertive presidents of one of the Central Asian countries was briefed on this, and he was really quite offended by it. And he said, that's not how we think of ourselves. When we think of our strategic neighborhood, we don't think of Bangladesh, we don't think of Nepal, we don't think of Sri Lanka. We're European. That's how we think of our connectivity to Europe. So he himself was trying to center his country on some conception that included the transatlantic West. But it struck me, number one, that the transatlantic West now faces the headwind from the way the US pulled out of Afghanistan. Second, the legacy that you've critiqued so effectively over the years of what the US did in Afghanistan. Three, the reality that the West is not as present as, let's say, China as a provider of capital, infrastructure, big projects. And then last, doesn't play its hand that well, in my view. If you think about what the United States could play, for example, that would be useful, not just in Central Asia, but across the region. Let's leave Iran and Afghanistan out of it because of the nature of the regimes. But rather than trying to out-China China, the answer would be to leverage uniquely American strengths, or let's face it, uniquely European strengths: English language, connections to the global capital markets, voting weight in the international financial institutions, innovation, venture capital, best-in-class science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But is that really what the play is? I've never really detected it, even coming out of, as Asel said, this kind of new set of processes that are designed to create, from my vantage point, the illusion and maybe a little bit of the reality that the West is still present. So what's the right hand? I'll throw this to everybody. Is the West basically irrelevant, except for the process and diplomatic sense? And how could that be? How could that script be flipped a little bit in collaboration with countries in the region? What's missing?
Well, I mean, Evan, look,
watermelon to
yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, look, couldn't agree more. Like, so to Asel's point about like U.S. strategy and the lecturing, I was a lecturer. I worked for USAID promoting democracy under Uzbekistan's Karimov. That was not an easy job, and I got sent out of the country because of it. But the people just tuned it out, and I didn't like doing it when I was doing it. I felt like this isn't winning anyone's hearts and minds. This isn't convincing anybody of anything, and it's really hollow. Like so for so long the U.S. had military bases and human rights. It's like security assistance and human rights lectures, and so the strategy was so incoherent. So there's a huge opportunity right now in ed. Right, English language, and what the U.S. is investing is tiny. So I was happy as a result of the C5+1 that like the ideology was toned down a little bit. It's not that these values aren't important; they'll always be part of what the U.S. does, but you can't make them central to the relationship and not act on them, right? And that's been the problem. I mean, so the problem is that, there's this huge opportunity in education. This is an area where, Asel and I both work in, where there's so many opportunities for partnerships. The sky is the limit right now. And this is where the hunger for the West is. And gosh darn it, I invite scholars. I just got a colleague yesterday, a very senior academic, can't get a visa to the United States. I mean, so we have a broken immigration system that doesn't facilitate the kinds of things that really upsets people. We are our own, in the United States, our own worst enemy when it comes to these kinds of things. It's deeply insulting. And there's so many opportunities in the private sector, in STEM. Of course, the United States cannot, generate capital and tell, send the banks over to tell people where to invest, but they can certainly pave the way with investments in things like education.
So others should jump in, but if anybody wants to pull India into this, I wanted our colleague in New Delhi, Vijay Gokhale, who's at Carnegie, India, and is the former Foreign Secretary of India, to jump into this, because some of what you're saying, STEM, English language, I mean, India has an offering in the region too that could leverage some of those things, and I've wondered why that hasn't been as effective as it should either. I don't know. Does anybody else want to jump on this question?
maybe because Central Asia isn't the lies in the priorities of the U.S. It just seems like the idea back in the 90s for Washington, correct me if I'm wrong, was that in the nearest decades, the US would be promoting democracy and human rights. And in a couple of decades, it would have Central Asia, which is an ally, right behind Russia or China. I don't know. Back then, of course, it was not about Russia and China, but rather about a global promoting of democracy. But still, it seems like at the moment everyone realized that democracy is impossible in Central Asian countries under the current political regimes. I think everyone kind of lost interest in the West, and it just feels like right now spending money on Central Asia is equal to supporting the authoritarian regimes there, which is not something that countries in the West would want to do. I don't know. This is the feeling, I guess, that I have.
But why aren't countries in the region demanding it? I mean, like, let's flip it, okay? So let's just say, for the sake of argument, if you want to argue, American strategy stinks. European strategy stinks. They're not leveraging their strengths. They're not offering anything in the region. Why isn't the region demanding it? So, for example, we talked about Russian language being in decline. I mean, I'm sorry, but Russian is a global language. It's a cosmopolitan language across many countries. So is English. So if Russian is going to decline, then you need to swap in, if you want connections to global markets, some other global language. So logically, that would be English. So why are countries in the region not demanding more English language training and English language opportunities or upskilling? We published a paper at Carnegie last year on how China's investments in the region have transitioned from big infrastructure, mostly importing Chinese labor, to a lot of value-added stuff that includes local labor. And it's happening partly because countries are demanding it from China. So why are they not more assertively demanding things from Western partners too, in a way that even if the Western capitals don't get it, just kind of shake them by the coat and force them to get it? Why is that not happening if there's greater agency?
They are asking. And they are asking actually much more important and pragmatic things. So, of course, it's English language, but also scholarships for youth. But there is just in general the decline of European scholarship, of American scholarship for students in the region. All of it was now redirected to Ukraine. So there were a lot of cuts. That's first. The smaller states of Central Asia are demanding other pragmatic things. If you want to lessen to decrease the influence of Russia in the region, then try to divert migration flows. Give labor quotas for Tajiks, Uzbeks, and the Kyrgyz. So I don't know, if each member state of European Union gives, let's say, 5,000 quotas per year, that's already a huge contribution to the lessening of the Russian influence in the region. But on that things, that starts already being problematic, because no European Union members want more migrants to their doors, although their economies, of course, require manpower. So the Kyrgyz and many others are demanding the US visas, as just Jan said. But the US is not giving the visas. Actually, the US doesn't have any budget. This strategy, the US strategy, which was about connectivity, so that the region doesn't depend on one player, meaning Russia, which was published in February. That $25 million for the entire region was actually appeared only thanks to cutting the money from Ukraine, which means that strategy doesn't have its own separate budget for Central Asia. So, I mean, yeah, these are so it's not about that they're not asking, they are asking. But I think there's also, on the other side, also a lot of Islamophobia, a lot of phobia about authoritarianism, migrants, and many other things, which also impede the cooperation.
So we're 7 minutes over, so I'm gonna give everybody one last shot, and I'm gonna go in reverse order. We may or may not have lost Jen, but if you project out, let's say 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, we're launching an initiative here. What are the kind of top conceptual themes that you think are going to shape the future of the continental landmass of Eurasia, other than the traditional ones? What do we need to be thinking about in this? So I'm going to start with Nicole. I'll go Temur, Asel, and then if Jen is with us, we'll go to her too.
Well, I would say actually continental Asia actually shaping broader global developments. And I think one example of this is actually Kazakhstan and Kazakhstan's involvement with the treaty on the TPMW treaty. So the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, Kazakhstan's played quite a prominent role in this. It's really promoted nuclear security. So seeing Central Asian, continental Asian states rise to more global levels where they actually are shaping global norms as well.
So from the inside out. So
Yeah.
that's okay. So Temur, what are the themes we need to be considering that we haven't talked about?
I also think about the region being in the middle of sanctioned countries and how they economically adapt to the new reality and try to gain as much as possible from their very kind of limited position. Because on the one hand, it seems that being surrounded by countries that are under sanctions is a disadvantage, but in reality, as some countries in Central Asia or around the continental Asia show, it might also be turned into an advantage.
So as an opportunity, conflict as an opportunity rather than a challenge. So I presume, just to make that real for our audience, the best example being Kazakhstan, trying to take advantage of global multinational companies that are being forced out of Russia by sanctions by getting them to relocate both their headquarters and their sales and services hubs for the region to Almaty or Astana. Right. That's what you mean? Yeah.
Yes.
Asel?
I think from, I join Nicole and Temur. I think these are excellent ideas. And from my perspective, I'm always interested in this shifting identities, both state identity and societal identities, which are really right now taking place, which I think because that would also contribute to the ways different domestic and external actors will take into account when approaching and strategizing about the region.
Okay. Jen, we lost you, but key conceptual themes for this initiative as we project out for the next 1, 3, 5 years.
I just, a positive outlook, I think, is really important because it's a really exciting time. It's a very exciting time. We're seeing things that we haven't seen in a very long time or ever before, since there have been independent states. But also since the decolonial, since World War II. Since looking at how these countries are dealing with one another, the fast pace of diplomacy for good and for bad. It's not all positive, right? They can do some bad things with each other. But there's so many opportunities, especially on thinking about the positive sum, thinking about the gains that can be had from cooperation, that really helps us flip the script from some of the zero-sum thinking that has been present in this region for a very long time. You're either with us or against us, you're with the North or you're with the South, that these countries, just looking at Iran, right? To me, is like this incredible example. And looking at Iran, looking what's going on between Iran and Pakistan, right? Going from Delhi to Tashkent. This is such a dynamic region. And as we said, that this isn't going to be the U.S. isn't going to be the central player here, but has to keep up, and that these the region itself is changing, and it's no longer. I would just reemphasize: we can't define Central Asia as opposed to the rest of the region anymore, and really seeing these connectivities between this diverse region where people are trading and they're traveling. I think it's very, very exciting.
Well, that's great. So that's why we're launching this initiative. And, for context for the audience, one of the things I love working about the Carnegie Endowment is it's a genuinely global institution. If you Carnegie is headquartered in Washington. I'm American, Jen's American, Nicole's American, but the reality is Washington, it's like Central Party headquarters. And then there are all these other Carnegies. There's one in Brussels, there's one in New Delhi, there's one in Beirut, there's one in Beijing. There's one in Berlin where Temur works, formerly in Moscow. And so I wake up every morning, I got 175 colleagues, and I'd say 85 to 90 of them are not American. And so at a time when the world is getting less American-centric, and in some ways is less American-centric than I've ever seen it in my career, sometimes Americans, we have a tendency to be more American-centric than ever. But the reality is, at an institution like this, we can leverage these different parts and these different colleagues to try to recenter the conversation. So this is an initiative that we hope is going to span the whole Carnegie platform. We have colleagues that work on Turkey. We have colleagues that work on Iran. We have colleagues like, as I said, Vijay Gokhale, who's sitting in India, that work on India. And that's why we called it Continental Asia and not Central Asia, because we want to pull both the outside in and look from the inside out and look at a set of issues that span this landmass. So as I said at the beginning, we're not just talking about the water, but the land, particularly in the Asian part of the Eurasian continent too. So that's what we'll do. We'll do it through research. We'll do it with convening. And we're thrilled that you were able to join us for this. And I hope you'll stay tuned. We'll build a little website. We'll have research. We'll do events like this. And we're going to look at a whole variety of issues, not just geopolitics, but economics, technology, culture, innovation, the whole kit and caboodle. And at least for today, let me thank my colleagues, Jen, Asel, Nicole, Temur, for joining us, and all of you. And look forward to seeing what we can produce with this. Thanks, team. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.